It's a great pleasure to introduce Nivethitha Ganapathiram, who's going to talk to us about epistemic injustice and post-pandemic medical education. How can anthropological perspectives move us towards a fairer future? Nivethitha is a final year medical student. We're very happy to have her. Awesome.
Great, thank you so much. Really happy and humbled to be able to speak at this event, and thank you so much for putting it together. Let me just do that. So yes, I'm a final year medical student, and I've been more interested in this area after completing my master's in philosophy, politics and economics of health at UCL, which I did as an intercalation. So these are some of the ideas that I discussed in my thesis, and then how I've tried to apply them in medical school through student-led curriculum change. So yeah, I start here with some images from the past 9 months. The pandemic has laid bare the rampant structural racism and inequality that's at work in our society, and has been at work in our society for a long time. And against this backdrop of emerging data that revealed stark racial disparity in the COVID-19 mortality and morbidity, George Floyd was publicly murdered at the hands of the police. Anti-racist uprisings ignited all over the world, many of them led by young Black people. We saw the toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston, and calls to deliver the same fate to the Churchill statue in Parliament Square. So the reason I speak about this is because we find ourselves at a time when the macro-political has collided viscerally and become deeply entangled with the question of how do we go about bettering the health of our society. And while these conversations have long since been happening, while the data's always been there, now in this particular moment, that particular discourse has become very difficult to ignore or to dismiss. So this is the backdrop. In the immediate midst of all this, I sat in an induction on the first day of my final year at school. This was in June. And in this induction, not a single comment was made by any of the members of faculty in solidarity with, or even just simply acknowledging what was unfolding all around us sociopolitically as we went about studying and practicing medicine. When Black and brown students legitimately asked, why not? Why did you not make a comment? A medical student types, medicine is apolitical. So as I reflected on this comment that was made, the question that I became very curious about is, what are the particular conditions that have been cultivated by medical education in the way that it is currently configured that give rise to such a comment, especially against such a backdrop? Nodding to Latour, we can then ask, has critique run out of steam? Perhaps for both clinicians and for patients, the certainty of scientific objectivity, something that we think of as impervious to the push and pull of social and political forces, is something that's far more alluring or safe than opening the door to the uncertainty of criticism. Criticism that necessarily intends to say there is no sure ground. There is no one way of knowing, or one way of coming to know, or indeed one truth to know. Perhaps this wanting to feel safe has something to do with it, and perhaps this is especially true in this sort of post-truth politics, when the pandemic has both been concomitantly denied, but then has also rendered the future of our health, of our work, of our lives uncertain indeterminately. But to me, what I found particularly curious about this comment is that it speaks to how the positivist biomedical agenda has such a powerful grasp, even still, on the way that we're taught medicine, and in turn, the way that we will practice medicine very soon as future doctors. Medicine's epistemic culture valorizes scientific objectivity and positivism, so much so that even in this moment where health is so acutely politicized in such a compelling way, one is able to quite easily reject the social and political and cultural dimensions of health and illness completely. I think that this reflects the values of the institution, and it reveals the knowledge that we prioritize, what is deemed important for us to know, and which forms of knowledge and which forms of knowing are commonly understood by doctors and medical students and which are not. So if we zoom out from the microcosm of my induction webinar, we see something similar playing out more macroscopically. So if we look at the COVID-19 Public Health England review of disparities in risks and outcomes, we see that this review simply stated that Black and brown people are more likely to die from this virus than white people, with Black men being at greatest risk. It omitted any mention of structural racism as the primary cause of ethnic disparity in the COVID-19 death rate. Mainstream media and even major medical journals labeled the fact that ethnic minority groups were suffering the greatest insult during this pandemic as a mystery. But it's important to ask, a mystery to whom? Doctors and scientists, their knee-jerk response was to choose to spotlight the genetic and immunological factors as the culprit in this case, even though there's very limited evidence to show that biological factors are implicated in the racial disparity. There was this collective ignorance of the overwhelming and long-standing evidence base that shows that the roots of this disparity are predominantly social and political in nature. So this state of perpetual and periodic shock precludes action, because to be shocked by something implies that it was previously unknown. And we can see this in Matt Hancock's comment, which enacts this politics of surprise. He presents the disparity as mystifying, as something to be got to the bottom of. And when we look back at the decades of research, it seems untoward to assert that it's surprising that Black and brown bodies faced the brunt of the pandemic fallout. It's certainly not surprising to Black and brown academics, healthcare professionals, activists, students, and service users who've been raising their voice about these structural issues, but have long since been silenced and marginalized. The Health Service Journal reported that an earlier draft of the review had a section summarizing responses from more than 1,000 ethnic minority community organizations and individuals, many of which suggested what is already known, that structural racism is a significant contributing factor to the increased risk from the COVID-19 virus. Here we see the comment from the Muslim Council of Britain, and we can directly contrast this with Matt Hancock's comment. It clearly asserts that extensive research already exists and evidence base already exists to demonstrate the structural racism and discrimination that is rife within the NHS. So when Public Health England omitted the contributions of these BAME organizations in the final report, it was an act of epistemic injustice. And the epistemic injustice here is twofold. First, with regards to the producer of knowledge, it dismissed the testimony of these already marginalized voices, marginalizing their narratives further. And in ignoring their contribution, it deflated their credibility. And secondly, it's also unjust with regards to the fact that it privileges a certain kind of knowledge over another. And in the evidence hierarchy, the quantitative is always preferred over the narrative. So it generates this particular type of knowledge that perpetuates this politics of surprise, that erases and invisibilizes these structural inequalities, and it sustains the biomedical paradigm and that paradigm's monopoly within medicine on what constitutes valid knowledge. And this reflects the values of the institution by revealing what type of knowledge is sort of seen as important. And while COVID-19 is a new disease, this shock at the racial disparities that the pandemic illustrates is not new. So in this way, the politics of surprise works both to reinforce the knowledge of some groups as meaningful, and to ascribe that the knowledge of others as inconsequential. And this then translates into persistent social injustice, because what this report allowed Public Health England to do was tokenistically acknowledge the disparity, but then overlook the need to generate a structural response until, of course, they were held to account by these BAME organizations. So the pandemic compels us to look harder at how we're producing knowledge about illness, the way that we're conceptualizing ill health, and that is also to look into medicine's epistemic culture and how it's configured, and how that can all too often lend itself to the erasure and sustained ignorance of the lived experiences of marginalized patient groups on the ground. In my experience as a medical student, I've observed firsthand how there is a rigid epistemic hierarchy entrenched within the medical curriculum at every level. It encourages us, wills us to believe that illness is best captured and understood through the biomedical idiom. Biomedical reductionism is overstated and overvalued within the medical curriculum. And this in turn undermines the value of different forms of knowledge and different perspectives. It leaves less time, less resource, less conceptual space in the collective consciousness for alternative perspectives and a more interdisciplinary discourse. So there was one study that recently surveyed 25 UK medical schools and looked at over 47,000 teaching events. And it showed that only 1.8% of the curriculum was dedicated to the subjects that might lend themselves to the humanities or the social sciences, so alternative perspectives. And with such little time being sort of attributed to these alternative perspectives, and to begin to discuss the structural makeup of disease, it's unsurprising that our doctors and our medical students sometimes struggle to make sense of what the COVID-19 pandemic might say about the wider world that we live in. And this is the way in which we see the politics of surprise at play in medical education. I've been in many seminars and tutorials and even informal conversations on the ward when doctors offer explanations for racial disparity that forces medicine into playing contortionist to its pre-existing biomedical identity. There's such a palpable unwillingness and discomfort with explicitly naming structural racism as the culprit, because this opens up this alternative perspective. It forces us to engage with, a different way of looking at health. So this is why, perhaps, where the work to undo and counter epistemic injustice in the clinic and the community might be best done within medical education. It might be a good place to start, and the place where it's most useful and most valuable. So from the very first day of medical school, the utmost importance of evidence-based practice is drilled into us. And inherent within the practice of evidence-based medicine is this hierarchical categorization of evidence based on the way in which it was produced. And this, of course, is said to be the best way to ensure effectiveness and efficiency. And within this hierarchy, RCTs, meta-analyses, quantitative forms of data inhabit a privileged and fiercely protected niche at the very top of the hierarchy. And they're constantly described as gold standard, despite what question you might be seeking to answer. So this perspective assumes very simple and linear models of cause and effect. It sort of encourages us to dismiss the wider context within which these things are taking place. And because the influence of evidence-based medicine is so pervasive through medical education, we're inclined to think that our role as doctors stops at discrete biomedical interventions. So we look for something to target. For infection, the target is the pathogen. For cancer, the target is the tumor. For depression, the serotonin channels. So the problem with trained doctors to think in this way is that it obscures an important fact, which is that pathogenesis goes beyond the biological. The ontology of illness exceeds solid contours of a simple biomedical object. Pathogenesis does not obey these rules of linear causality because it's concerned with complex systems in which an effect has a plurality of causes and a cause has a plurality of effects. And all of this is interacting in a disordered and chaotic way and being influenced by very specific contexts of space and time. And this is not fully accounted for in the way that we're taught medicine, and that is problematic. Medicine's preoccupation with disorder and objectivity is reflected in medical education's rigid stratification of knowledge, of symptoms, and of people. And often the justification that is given, that is cited for this, obsession with objectivity and order is this ethical principle of do no harm, above all. But I wonder if this justification holds true in practice. Because after all, medicine's taxonomies, its hierarchies, its protocols express legacies of colonial hegemony, and they're constructed on this pseudo-universality, which is necessarily inscribed with the experiences of the white, male, cisgender, heterosexual subject. So the further that you get away from this idealized reference point, the less sense this ordering makes. For example, even the use of the term BAME, there's an inherent homogenization of diverse of diverse groups that this term is used to describe. Another example that I think of is the fact that even now, my obstetrics and gynecology placement at medical school is referred to as women's health. And the fact that it is within this module that I learn about sexual and reproductive health. So these ways of categorizing that are used in medical education do have trickle down and cause harm to our patients. And they have to be problematized. And we can do this by questioning the validity and the usefulness of these rigid epistemic hierarchies that exist within medical education. When we seek knowledge about illness, we're seeking knowledge about something that is not static and predefined, but it's perpetually emergent, and they have unstable boundaries, as I was saying, and they interact not only with each other, but they also interact with the knower, and they do so in infinitely unpredictable ways, and are in turn fundamentally constructed by these interactions. So there's such complexity here, and this complexity is obscured in the way that we learn about medicine, and that's problematic. And I think one of the reasons is because with complexity you get uncertainty, and with uncertainty you have this opportunity for fallibility, and obviously with fallibility this has the opportunity to do harm. And I think that's why we need to change our understanding of, above all, do no harm, and assert that the only ethical demand that we can make of doctors and policymakers is the minimization of harm. So then we can think about how can we achieve the minimization of harm. And it can be suggested that an interpretive approach is more likely to be able to do this than a reductive one. So another interesting question to ask is, who are we protecting from harm, and who are we perhaps exposing to harm by doing medicine and learning about medicine in the way that we currently do? And following on from that, how can we do medicine and learn about medicine in a different way that minimizes harm for the greatest number of people? When we know that structural racism directly and significantly contributes to the ill health of our patients, we have to engage with this socially and politically within medical education, and therefore within our caregiving, if we are to truly uphold our ethical responsibility as doctors to do no harm. And as I say, we can begin this work in medical education by working towards centering the interpretive approach rather than the reductive one. So this brings me on to the anthropological perspective. So the way that I'm conceptualizing an anthropological perspective is as one that is grounded in the act of interpretation. It involves approaching the object of knowledge, not as static, not as a static fact to deduce and learn by rote, but as a dynamic and complex phenomenon, always becoming rather than simply being, to be interpreted in a particular historical moment. And it's about constructing an interpretation of evidence-based medicine, not through the logic of objective fact and statistics, but through the lexicon of meanings and values and relationships. And it's a commitment to being sensitive and discerning to the multidimensional cultural processes that sculpt the ontological emergence of illness. So this image this painting that I've put up, I used it when I gave a webinar to my peers as part of the global health curriculum. And I use this painting to try and convey and visualize what I imagine the anthropological perspective to look like. This is a painting by Dora Lamb, and I've linked her Instagram there if you'd like to follow her. So this particular painting, aptly named Free the Storm, is of the jazz collective Steam Down, who perform brilliant improvised unrehearsed jazz at their weekly sessions. And Dora Lamb paints these musicians in real time. And I think there's something to be learned from the way the artist approaches her subject. There's a certain dynamism and an embracing of complexity. And the way that she paints them in real time within that and captures them in that particular moment means that she paints the musicians as she experiences the music herself. And her experience of that music is reflected in what she paints and the art that she produces. So how does this relate to the anthropological perspective in medical education? Well, when we approach our subject, that is medical knowledge, we can begin to think of it as dynamic and complex rather than as static and objective. And we can begin to interrogate our own positionality within the wider picture of the world that we're trying to understand, where illness happens. And in doing this, we can begin to see ourselves as interpreters of health and illness, rather than as steadfast knowers. And when we start to think of ourselves as interpreters, I think we can engender a structural humility, an epistemic humility that makes space for alternative, perhaps very divergent interpretations from our own. And so in this way, anthropological perspectives can encourage doctors to become comfortable with difference, with the pluralism of knowledge, and ultimately comfortable with relinquishing our power. So I came across this tweet by Dr. Amber Spry, and I felt like it really captured what I felt medical, or what I'm trying to convey that medical education needs. It needs to concern itself with priming medical students and doctors to be more curious and to encourage us to approach alternative forms of knowledge from alternative sources with curiosity and with humility, rather than with mistrust and dismissiveness. And I think that what Dr. Amber Spry is describing here is really interesting, because taking such a perspective can unshackle pedagogy, and it can move us away from this idea that knowledge production and learning has to happen within rigid boundaries of the textbook or of the lecture hall or of the journal or of the ward. And it brings us towards this embodied pedagogy, where something as everyday as cooking rice presents an opportunity to learn and further our knowledge, and even inform how we practice caregiving as doctors. So I just wanted to speak a little, okay, I've got some time. I just wanted to speak a little about the work that we're doing at GKT School of Medicine, and how we're trying to capture these ideas that I've discussed and these reflections within the work that we're doing in the curriculum. So we've started a project, Structuring the Clinic, which I work on with my friend and colleague, Natasha Chilambo, and this work is supported by Dr. Andy Guys as well. And I think what we're trying to do in this work is that it's not just talking about the social determinants of health or the political dimension of health, because to a certain extent that happens already. But yet there seems to be a disconnect with how this teaching informs and is operationalized within our clinical practice. And this is what we want to address. So I think what we're trying to do is that it's not just about talking about these issues, but it's also as equally about how we go about talking about these things and how we go about teaching these things. So the way in which we teach health and illness should enact and embody our values and our commitment to epistemic humility and curiosity. So this screenshot is a shot from the music video from Sons of Kemet, Your Queen is a Reptile, which we played for our peers at the beginning of our very first webinar. And throughout the two webinars that we gave, we incorporated music from Sons of Kemet, Skepta, scenes from Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You, poems from Manzoor Khan's post-colonial banter anthology, and ideas from Tom Stoppard's plays and Arundhati Roy's essays. So then we thought about what happens when we draw on these artists and thinkers to inform what we teach final year medical students. Well, what it meant for us was an attempt to question and disrupt the narrowness of medicine's reductionist epistemological culture. It was an attempt to expand our understanding of what constitutes a valid source of knowledge. It was an attempt to enact epistemic humility by taking this interdisciplinary approach and demonstrating that we can learn from different sources that hold a different kind of knowledge and learn in a very different kind of way that can profoundly inform our clinical practice. And when we hear the rousing music of the Sons of Kemet and hear their lyrics that I've put up here, we claim our right to question your obsolete systems. When we hear that music, when we hear these lyrics, I think we teach in a way that encourages cognitive disequilibrium. We encounter an unfamiliar vantage point in a similarly unfamiliar way, and we may feel uncomfortable, but then we question, why do we feel uncomfortable? We critically self-reflect on our own assumptions and our own positionality. And this way of learning is one that taps into both our cognitive and affective domains. And in this way, it reflects how caregiving itself demands engagement with both our cognitive and our affective domains. So the four words that I would use to sort of describe this approach that we're trying to do in our teaching is interpretive, encourage students to be more interpretive, encourage students to take an interdisciplinary approach that equally values other forms and other disciplines, transcultural, and self-reflexive. So I'll sort of finish here and sort of coming back to the pandemic. So this is the final essay in Arundhati Roy's recently published collection, and it was titled "The Pandemic is a Portal." So I think why we started thinking around how can we think about post-pandemic medical education is because we find ourselves in this political moment where we have a great potential for change. The anti-racism movement, the decolonizing movement is quickly gaining traction in areas where it's been needed all along. And there's such an urgency. And that urgency is definitely necessary because these issues are urgent. But I would just wanted to note that it's important to be mindful of tokenism, because marginalized voices are prone to exploitation, especially amidst this urgency, because they can sometimes be tokenistically represented. So the work of these voices should not be allowed to be co-opted by the very institutions that these voices struggle against, because diversifying into epistemically unjust curriculums does not disrupt or uproot. It simply reproduces the same inequalities, just in a different form. But this being said, the pandemic is a portal and can be a portal. azadi means freedom. And in engendering epistemic humility within our medical curriculum, we can bring freedom for equitable knowledge exchange across disciplines and across cultures, freedoms to reimagine a counterfactual, an alternative way of doing medicine, of teaching medicine, and freedom for collaboration towards a transformative agenda and ultimately a fairer future for our patients. Thank you.